At the dawn of the Eternal City, when the hills of Latium were still shaped more by the force of myth than by the precision of marble, religion was not a choice or an elaborate system, but a natural pulse of existence, even before Rome was Rome. Before the forums rose and legacies were engraved in bronze, there was a people who looked to the sky in search of omens, who feared the invisible forces that inhabited nature and, in doubt, worshipped everything they could not comprehend. The primitive religiosity of the Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans did not know of majestic temples nor gods with perfect human features, but venerated the powers that flowed through the world, in the river, in the tree, in the stone, and in the lightning. It was an immanent religion where each aspect of life and landscape hid a numen, a spiritual or divine force, that had to be respected, honored, feared. Thus was born the most fundamental conception of Roman religiosity, that of the atmos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors, transmitted from generation to generation like an invisible thread, linking the living to the dead, humans to gods, the city to eternity. There was no written doctrine nor systematized theology, only carefully preserved ritual practices whose neglect could attract chaos and the wrath of higher powers. Roman religion, from its very beginnings, was above all a practice, an orthopraxy more than an orthodoxy. What mattered was not to believe, but to do, to act, to offer, to sacrifice, to ask, to thank, and above all, to maintain the pax deorum, the peace with the gods, without which no harvest would prosper, no army would triumph, no city would flourish. At the heart of these ancestral practices were the religiosity and the pantheons, penates, tutelary deities who protected the home and the family. They were the first gods of Rome, predating temples and statues, invisible and omnipresent, silent guardians of the domestic fire that must never be extinguished. In every domus, in every hillside hut, there was a small altar, the lararium, where the fathers of the family lit flames and placed offerings to ensure the clan's protection and prosperity. Not by chance, when Aeneas fled from Troy and landed on the coasts of Latium, according to legend, he carried not only his son and his elderly father, but also the penates of his land, as if carrying the very soul of civilization. It was a powerful symbol. Wherever the penates were, there Rome existed in potential. The mythical tradition of Rome's foundation reinforces this deeply religious character of the city. It was not just a city founded by heroes, it was a sacred space ritually demarcated. Romulus, by tracing the Pan Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the future city, with his plough, established not just physical, but also spiritual limits. To cross or violate this line without the proper rite was an affront to the divine order and to the very existence of Rome. Thus, the city emerged as a microcosm where the human and the divine intertwined indissolubly. The fratricide of Remus, in leaping over the furrow traced by Romulus, is more than a tragic episode. It is a clear sign that the foundation of Rome did not tolerate transgression against its sacred nature. Besides domestic cults, early Romans practiced public rituals aimed at the fertility of the land and the protection of the community. Agricultural festivals such as the Feriae Latinae and ceremonies dedicated to Tellus, the goddess Earth, and Ceres, the goddess of cereals, expressed this need for harmonious integration with natural forces. Each stage of the agricultural cycle, the ploughing, the sowing, the harvest, was accompanied by sacrifices and prayers in the hope of securing the favor of the deities. Religion thus sustained not only spiritual life, but also the economy, politics, and food security of the city. The role of priests, even from these early origins, was central in mediating between men and gods. The ancient priestly functions, such as those of the prime flamines, dedicated to the worship of specific gods, and the current vestals, charged with keeping Vesta's sacred fire perpetually burning, established a religious hierarchy that reflected and reinforced the social hierarchy. The virginity of the vestals, for example, symbolized the purity necessary to maintain divine protection over Rome. Their failure or impurity was not merely a personal issue, it was a threat to the city's stability and to the Pax Deorum itself. Another fundamental element of archaic Roman religiosity was the practice of a divination. Before any public or military action, it was necessary to consult the gods, interpreting natural signs, the flight of birds, the lightning, the entrails of sacrificed animals. The augurs were specialists in this sacred craft, and their word could alter the fate of battles, suspend elections, or determine the validity of a law. Religion, therefore, was not a separate sphere from politics or military life. It was their very condition of possibility, the invisible axis that sustained social and cosmic order. But if primitive Roman religion was so deeply rooted in tradition and custom, how could it evolve to the point that, centuries later, it embraced the cult of a foreign god, crucified and resurrected from the eastern margins of the empire? How could the city that once venerated Jupiter as king of the gods later become the spiritual capital of Christianity? This extraordinary transformation, spanning over 1,000 years of history, begins precisely in this fertile soil, saturated with rites, domestic sacredness, and reverent respect for invisible forces. The seed of Roman religion was planted in the intimate relationship between humans and gods, in the unshakable belief that human success depended on divine collaboration. This religious ethos, at once flexible and conservative, would allow Rome to integrate foreign cults, adapt to new influences, and ultimately be transformed by them irreversibly. But before we narrate this long and fascinating journey from Jupiter to Jesus, it is necessary to understand how the Roman pantheon was structured, how it consolidated itself as a divine and political order that would sustain the empire for centuries. And that is precisely what we will explore in the next topic: the Roman pantheon, gods, cults, and the divine order, where we will delve into the majesty and complexity of the deities that shaped the soul of Roman civilization. At the beating heart of Roman civilization rose a complex spiritual architecture, the pantheon of gods and goddesses that, more than mere mythological entities, constituted the very backbone of Rome's social, political, and cosmic order. These gods did not inhabit a distant and unreachable Olympus, but were present at every corner, in every square, in every public or private gesture, shaping the Roman's perception of himself, his city, and his destiny. Unlike modern conceptions of religion, Roman polytheism did not demand exclusive devotion or fervent belief. Above all, it required respect, ritual participation, and the careful maintenance of the pax deorum, the peace with the gods, that vital harmony without which the city and the empire could not prosper. At the apex of this divine order stood Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the king of the gods and supreme protector of the Roman state. His temple on the Capitoline Hill dominated the urban landscape like a sacred beacon guiding the city's destinies. To him were dedicated military triumphs, the prayers of senators, and the most solemn public sacrifices. But Jupiter did not reign alone. Alongside him stood gods and goddesses that composed a hierarchical and functional system reflecting the needs and values of Roman society. Juno, his wife, was the guardian of marriage and fertility. Minerva, goddess of wisdom and the arts, protected artisans and military strategists. Mars, the fierce god of war, was the patron of the legions that conquered the world. This pantheon, far from static or immutable, was a living organism that transformed over the centuries, incorporating foreign deities, adapting myths and functions as Rome expanded its borders and absorbed new peoples. Thus gods like Bacchus, originally the Greek Dionysus, or Mercury, Hermes, became part of the official cult, not as mere borrowings, but as genuine expressions of Roman spirituality, reinterpreted in light of their own tradition. Rome's public religion, in turn, was carefully structured around state cults, administered by specialized priests and regulated by a strict calendar of festivals and rituals. The Q Pontifex Maximus, or the high priest, was the most important figure in this hierarchy, responsible for overseeing religious practices and ensuring their conformity with ancestral customs. Subordinate to him were the Flamines, priests dedicated to specific gods, such as the Flamen Dialis Eracramentes, who served Jupiter, or the Flamen Martialis, consecrated to Mars. These priests were chosen from among the most illustrious patrician families, reinforcing the indissoluble alliance between religion and politics. Among the most fascinating religious institutions of Rome were the Vestal Virgins, priestesses consecrated to the goddess Charles Vesta, guardian of the sacred fire, symbolizing the life and continuity of the Roman state. Chosen while still girls, The Vestals took vows of chastity and dedicated decades of their lives to maintaining the eternal flame in Vesta's temple at the Roman Forum. Their personal purity was considered essential for the protection of the city, and any breach of it resulted in severe punishments, such as live burial, one of the most terrible sentences in the Roman world. But the Roman pantheon was not limited to the great Olympian gods or state institutions. It also housed a myriad of lesser deities associated with specific aspects of daily life, nature, and labor. Gods like Janus Mythical, the god of doors and passages, were invoked before any beginning, whether a journey, a battle, or even a new day. Ceres, goddess of agriculture, presided over rituals linked to the fertility of the land, while Neptune, lord of the waters, was revered by sailors and fishermen. Even property boundaries were protected by the terminus gata, the god of borders, whose stone symbol could never be moved without grave religious consequences. Thus, Roman religion had a profoundly functional dimension. Every aspect of life, from birth to death, from planting to harvest, from war to diplomacy, found support and guidance in the relationship with one or more deities. This integrative vision was reflected in ritual practices, which followed fixed and precise formulas transmitted from generation to generation. Ritual error, an incorrect movement, a mispronounced word, could invalidate the entire sacrifice, requiring its repetition. More than an emotional expression of faith, Roman worship was a legal contract with the gods, a symbolic negotiation that guaranteed protection in exchange for reverence and formal observance. It is important to highlight that Roman religion was essentially inclusive. When conquering new territories, Rome often welcomed local gods, granting them a place in its already vast pantheon. This practice, known as interpretatio Romana, allowed foreign deities to be identified with equivalent Roman gods or integrated as new cults. Thus, when Rome conquered Greece, it did not destroy its temples nor forbid its cults. On the contrary, it reinterpreted them, aligning Zeus with Jupiter, Aphrodite with Venus, Ares with Mars, and so on. This syncretism was one of the secrets of Roman imperial success, the ability to expand without annihilating local cultures, absorbing and transforming instead of destroying. This same syncretism, however, would also create tensions, especially with the emergence of monotheistic religions that rejected the inclusive logic of Roman polytheism. Judaism, with its rigid defense of exclusive worship to Yahweh, and nascent Christianity, with its promise of universal salvation through a single God, directly challenged Rome's religious and political assumptions. But before these tensions culminated in persecutions and ultimately the religious transformation of the empire, the Roman pantheon enjoyed centuries of splendor, supporting the civil and military institutions of an unprecedented power. The pomp of religious processions, public spectacles in honor of the gods, animal sacrifices, and temple offerings formed a daily spectacle that reaffirmed day after day the greatness of Rome and the harmony between the human and the divine. Every military victory was celebrated with a triumph dedicated to Jupiter. Every public construction was preceded by rites to obtain divine favor. Every political decision was accompanied by auspices taken by the augurs. Religion was not a separate sphere from public life. It was the invisible cement that sustained the entire structure of Roman society. But even this solid and comprehensive pantheon was not immune to the transformations that time and contact with diverse cultures inevitably brought. With the advance of conquests and the incessant flow of peoples and beliefs into the heart of the empire, new cults began to gain space, especially the so-called Eastern mysteries, which offered devotees not only protection in this life, but also promises of salvation after death. And it is precisely about this fascinating openness of Rome to foreign cults that we will discuss in the next topic: religious syncretism, Greek and Etruscan influence on Roman religion, where we will see how Rome knew how to transform the other into part of itself, nourishing its own spiritual strength with the beliefs of conquered peoples. Few civilizations of antiquity demonstrated such an extraordinary capacity to absorb, reinterpret, and transform the religious beliefs of other peoples as Rome did. This process, known by historians as religious syncretism, was not a product of chance, but a conscious and refined strategy that allowed the Eternal City to expand its spiritual dominion in the same measure that it extended its political and military frontiers. Even before becoming mistress of the Mediterranean, Rome had already experienced and accepted profound cultural and religious influences from its closest neighbors, the Etruscans to the north and the Greeks to the south. The Etruscan influence was, without a doubt, one of the most decisive in the initial configuration of Roman religion. When Rome was still a modest city-state, the Etruscans already boasted a sophisticated culture, marked by a rich religious tradition that fascinated and inspired the Romans. Many of the rites and symbols that would define Rome's spirituality in the following generations have deep roots in the Etruscan world. The use of the toga praetexta, with its purple border adorning Roman priests and magistrates, is a direct legacy of Etruscan practices, as are the complex techniques of divination, especially haruspicy, the reading of signs in the entrails of sacrificed animals, a method that the Romans enthusiastically adopted and transformed into an indispensable instrument of political and military decision-making. The Etruscans also influenced the architectural conception of Roman temples, with their elevated platforms, triangular pediments, and majestic colonnades. The very Capitoline Hill, Rome's sacred mount where the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus stood, was shaped according to Etruscan patterns, uniting local tradition with the architectural splendor learned from the ancient lords of Latium. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Etruscans was the idea that the gods communicate their will to men through enigmatic signs, requiring a specialized class of interpreters to decipher them. Thus, alongside the augurs, arose the haruspices, consulted by generals before military campaigns and by senators in moments of crisis. However, no influence was as profound and comprehensive as that of Greece, whose deities, myths, and religious practices were gradually incorporated into the Roman universe, to the point of sometimes becoming indistinguishable. From the 4th century before Christ, with Roman expansion towards the south of the Italian peninsula and the consequent conquest of the cities of Jussus Magna Graecia, Rome had direct and continuous contact with the rich Hellenic tradition. This encounter was not a violent clash, but a gradual process of assimilation, marked by respect, admiration, and above all, adaptation. Thus, the supreme Greek god, Zeus, was identified with Jupiter, not only in attributes, but also in the mythological narratives surrounding him. The same happened with Hera, transformed into Juno, Ars, who became Mars, Aphrodite, who metamorphosed into Venus, and so on. However, the transposition was not merely nominal. The Romans, in absorbing these deities, reinterpreted them in light of their own historical and social experience. Mars, for example, who in Greek tradition was a secondary and often uncontrolled figure, emerged in Rome as one of the most venerated divinities, a symbol of the discipline and military virtue that sustained the empire. In addition to the identification of gods, Rome enthusiastically embraced many religious practices of Greek origin, such as the Orphic mysteries and the Dionysian celebrations, although in some cases it sought to regulate or even suppress them when they seemed to threaten public order. A notorious example was the repression of the Bacchanalia in 186 before Christ, when the Senate, fearing the destabilizing influence of these ecstatic and nocturnal celebrations, promulgated the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, severely restricting their practice. Roman religious syncretism also manifested itself in the adoption of new gods and foreign cults in response to specific spiritual or political needs. Thus, during the Second Punic War, when Hannibal threatened the gates of Rome, the Senate, seeking divine protection, decided to import the cult of Cybele, the Magna Mater of Phrygia, according to instructions contained in the Sibylline books. The goddess was received with all honors and installed on the Palatine Hill, where her cult, conducted by eunuch priests called Galli, became deeply rooted in the Roman religious landscape. This episode reveals not only Rome's openness to new cults, but also its instrumental perception of religion as an essential resource of the state. It was not merely about personal devotion, but a deliberate policy of spiritual integration, capable of reinforcing social cohesion, consolidating domination over conquered peoples, and amplifying the empire's prestige. The simultaneous presence of various cults and traditions, far from fragmenting Roman identity, strengthened it, creating a plural, dynamic, and resilient religiosity. In this context, interpretatio Romana played a central role. This concept, which designates the practice of identifying foreign gods with Roman equivalents, allowed Rome to welcome alien divinities without renouncing its own tradition. When the Romans encountered a new divinity, they interpreted it as a local manifestation of a deity already known. Thus, the Celts could continue worshipping Secis Lugus, provided he was recognized as a version of Mercury. The Egyptians would venerate Isis, but the Romans would integrate her into the pantheon as a legitimate and Roman divinity. This process, however, did not occur without tensions and resistances. Some cults, by their nature or practices, caused discomfort and even panic among the Roman elites. The cult of Bacchus, as we have seen, was repressed. Others, such as that of Mithras, aroused suspicion for their initiatory structure and the secret rituals they promoted. Nevertheless, many of these cults survived and flourished, especially among the lower classes and the army, offering devotees more intimate spiritual experiences of a mystical and salvific character, which the traditional state cult did not provide. This openness to religious diversity prepared the ground for one of the most radical transformations in the spiritual history of Rome, the rise of Christianity. A cult originating from the eastern periphery of the empire, initially seen as an obscure and subversive sect, but which, thanks to the universality of its message and the strength of its community organization, would end up conquering the heart of Rome itself, replacing the plural pantheon with exclusive and transcendent monotheism. But before we explore this monumental shift, it is necessary to understand how Roman religion permeated all aspects of daily and civic life, from the simplest superstitious practices to the auspices that decided the fate of military campaigns. That will be our next step. Religion and daily life, superstitions, auguries, and religion as civic duty, where we will see how the Roman lived and experienced the constant presence of the gods in his daily life. In ancient Rome, religion was not merely a set of beliefs or a separate dimension of public life. It was the very essence of daily existence, an invisible and omnipresent fabric that guided actions, decisions, and thoughts, from the most banal gestures to the most solemn acts of state. Roman religiosity was fundamentally practical. It did not require inner conversion or emotional adherence, but imposed a rigorous discipline of behaviors, observances, and rituals whose ultimate purpose was to preserve the Pax Deorum, that sacred peace which guaranteed the order of the cosmos, the prosperity of the city, and the security of households. Every Roman, from the humblest peasant to the most powerful senator, lived under the watchful eyes of the gods and the invisible powers that regulated the world. This gaze was not an abstraction. It manifested in multiple forms, through signs, omens, natural accidents, and extraordinary phenomena, that Roman men and women learned from an early age to recognize, interpret, and above all, respect. The relationship with the sacred was thus marked by profound ritual sensitivity and reverent fear, but also by confidence that, if the required formalities were fulfilled, divine benevolence would remain assured. Superstitions were omnipresent and took on various forms. Before leaving home, it was common for the Roman to offer small prayers to the Dileres and Advahepenates, the household tutelary deities, lighting the fire at the Pacas Lararium, the domestic altar that represented the family's spiritual protection. Simply tripping on the threshold was considered a bad omen, and a series of apotropaic gestures, such as touching wood or avoiding the utterance of certain names aloud, were part of daily routine in the attempt to ward off misfortune and attract fortune. These were not merely popular superstitions. Even the most experienced generals and the most skeptical politicians did not dare neglect purification and protection rites before an important endeavor. Central to this symbolic universe was the practice of augury, the interpretation of signs sent by the gods through nature. Before any significant act, whether an election, a declaration of war, the founding of a city, or the promulgation of a law, Roman magistrates, assisted by augurs, held ceremonies of sky observation, noting the movements of birds, lightning, or other natural phenomena to determine whether the gods approved or disapproved of the action. This procedure, known as an first auspice cards, was taken with extreme seriousness. A negative omen could suspend or annul a decision, while a favorable sign was interpreted as a guarantee of success. The augurs thus played an essential role in the functioning of the state, acting as privileged interpreters of the divine will. Their authority was such that often the very validity of popular assemblies or Senate decisions depended on their ritual approval. The famous expression "praesubnuntiatio," designating the official declaration of an unfavorable omen, had the power to suspend political meetings or prevent certain laws from being voted upon. This was not naive superstition, but an institutionalized mechanism that conferred upon religion a normative and regulatory power over the public sphere. Alongside augury, there was also the practice of haruspicy, inherited from the Etruscans, which consisted in reading the entrails, especially the liver, of sacrificed animals. The haruspices, priests specialized in this art, were consulted in times of crisis, such as epidemics, military defeats, or unusual natural phenomena, to determine which rites or sacrifices would be necessary to restore balance between men and gods. These practices, far from being seen as mere artifices or superstitions, were an integral part of Roman political and military rationality, guiding strategies and justifying decisions. The Roman calendar was punctuated by an impressive number of festive and ritual days, occupying more than a third of the year. Each month contained specific dates dedicated to particular gods or mythical events, with public festivals that mobilized the entire city. Among the most important were the Saturnalia, celebrated in honor of the Saturn, marked by banquets, gift exchanges, and a temporary inversion of social hierarchies, with slaves being served by their masters. The Lupercalia, an archaic rite of purification and fertility involving races and symbolic floggings carried out by the Luperci, priests of the cult, and the Oferiae Latinae, which gathered the peoples of Latium in a common celebration, reinforcing religious and political ties among the communities. Each of these festivals had a precise function, both in the spiritual and social plane. They renewed the bonds between the city and the gods, ensured the continuity of divine blessings over the community, and promoted citizen cohesion through shared rituals, public banquets, and theatrical or gladiatorial spectacles. Religion, in this sense, was a powerful instrument of our social integration and our political affirmation. Participating in the rites was not only an act of piety, but also an expression of citizenship. The Roman concept of religion, synthesized in the word "douta religiosity," carried precisely this sense of obligation, bond, and discipline. The term derives from the verb pis religar, meaning to bind, expressing the idea of a link between men and gods that could not be neglected without grave consequences. Hence the emphasis on formal observance of rites. More important than belief or subjective devotion was the correct performance of ceremonies, according to traditional formulas transmitted since immemorial times. Negligence, innovation, or impurity could break this bond, provoking what Romans feared above all, the ira deorum, the wrath of the gods. This reverent fear extended even to urban spaces, which were carefully demarcated according to religious principles. The foundation of a city, for example, required complex rites such as the inauguratio, which established the sacred limits of the territory and consecrated the space to divine favor. The very pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome, delimited not only the city's physical confines, but also its spiritual identity and mystical protection. In the domestic sphere, religion permeated all significant moments of family life. Births, marriages, and funerals were accompanied by specific rituals designed to obtain the god's blessing and to ensure the continuity of the gens rics, the family lineage that transcended individuals and connected the living to their ancestors. The maintenance of the ancestor cult, ibristas, through offerings at tombs and celebrations such as the apparentalia or the lemuria, ensured that the dead continued to protect the living and that the family's memory remained indelible. This everyday religiosity, impregnated with public and private rites, superstitions, and solemn ceremonies, gave Roman life a deeply ritualized and sacred character. There was no clear separation between the religious and the political, the public and the private, the human and the divine. Everything was interconnected, as parts of the same ordered cosmos, whose harmony depended on diligent observance of traditional practices. However, this same religiosity, so deeply rooted in customs and institutions, would begin to be challenged, especially from the 2nd century before Christ, with the introduction of new cults and spiritual practices originating from the empire's eastern provinces, offering individuals more intimate, mystical and salvific religious experiences. It is about this fascinating opening of the Roman world to Oriental cults and religious mysteries that we will discuss in the next topic: the mysteries and Eastern cults, Isis, Mithras and Cybele in the heart of Rome, where we will see how Rome, faithful to its syncretic vocation, welcomed and adapted new forms of religiosity that would forever change its spiritual landscape. As Rome expanded its frontiers beyond the hills of Latium, conquering provinces in Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt and the Near East, not only armies, wealth and slaves flowed into the urbs, but also beliefs, gods and rites that, little by little, transformed the spiritual landscape of the eternal city. This complex and profound interaction resulted in the incorporation of various Eastern cults into the heart of Rome, a phenomenon that redefined the contours of Roman religiosity and prepared the ground for even more radical changes in the centuries to come. Among the foreign cults that flourished in Rome, few were as influential and enigmatic as those of Isis, Mithras, and Cybele, 3 deities that, although originating from distinct traditions, offered the Romans a new spiritual dimension, marked by initiation rites, promises of salvation, and a more personal and emotional relationship with the divine. The cult of Isis, originating from pharaonic Egypt, arrived in Rome through the Hellenic world, especially after military campaigns in the east and contact with the Ptolemaic dynasty. Isis, mother goddess, queen of heaven, and lady of magic, fascinated the Romans with her syncretism, which associated her with multiple aspects of the feminine: fertility, protection, healing, and hidden wisdom. Unlike the traditional Roman pantheon, centered on gods who protected the collectivity and the state, Isis offered her devotees a more intimate spiritual experience, marked by initiation rites and the hope of personal redemption, especially in the afterlife. The temples of Isis, called Isea, proliferated in various cities of the empire, including Rome, where the Iseum Campense, in the Campus Martius, became a vibrant center of cult and devotion. The Isiac ceremonies, with their solemn processions, exotic music and purification rituals in sacred waters, contrasted sharply with the austerity of official Roman cult, attracting especially women, foreigners, and members of the lower classes, who found there a space of spiritual and social welcome that the state cult did not offer. Another Eastern cult that profoundly conquered the heart of the empire was that of Mithras, a deity of Indo-Iranian origin, whose cult spread through Rome via contact with soldiers of the legions stationed on the eastern frontiers. Mithraism presented peculiar characteristics that made it especially attractive to the military, an emphasis on discipline, loyalty, and overcoming trials through secret initiatory rites. Followers of Mithras gathered in underground temples, known as Mithraea, carefully constructed to imitate a cave, symbolizing the primordial space where, according to mythology, Mithras sacrificed the cosmic bulle, generating life and renewing the world. Mithraic rites were shrouded in secrecy, accessible only to initiates who passed through 7 degrees of spiritual elevation, represented by symbolic trials requiring courage, endurance, and fidelity. This initiatory structure, associated with the promise of life after death and eternal communion with Mithras, endowed the cult with a cohesive strength that rivaled, in spiritual terms, the traditional religious institutions of Rome. Not by chance, Mithraism especially flourished among soldiers, imperial officials, and merchants, itinerant and cosmopolitan groups who found in the Mithraic Brotherhood a solid and welcoming spiritual community. The cult of Cybele, the Magna Mater, mother of all gods originating from Phrygia in Asia Minor, was officially introduced in Rome in the year 204 before Christ, amidst the crisis provoked by Hannibal's invasion during the Second Punic War. According to the Sibylline books, An oracular compilation consulted in critical moments, Roman victory required the introduction of the Phrygian goddess's cult. Thus the black stone representing Cybele was transported with pomp and reverence to Rome, where her temple was erected on the Palatine Hill, one of the city's most sacred mounts. The cult of Cybele introduced practices and symbols that caused fascination and estrangement among the Romans. Her priests, the Gussed Galli, Dace, were characterized by ritual castration and ecstatic trance during celebrations in honor of the goddess, especially in the festivities known as megalesia. These manifestations, involving frenzied dances, strident music, and self-mutilations, strongly contrasted with the sobriety of traditional Roman cult, provoking, at times, reactions of censure and legal restrictions. Even so, Cybele was fully integrated into the Roman pantheon, being venerated as one of the protective deities of the city and the empire. These Eastern cults offered something that the Roman religious system, structured around civic duties and public rituals, rarely provided: an individual spiritual experience marked by the idea of personal transformation, salvation, and transcendence of death. The official cult, centered on maintaining order and stability, cared little about the salvation of the soul or the individual's destiny after death. In contrast, the Isiac, Mithraic, and other similar mysteries promised initiates a new life, a kind of spiritual rebirth, often symbolized by purification rites, baptisms, and sacred banquets. This mystical and personal dimension of these cults responded to an increasingly pressing spiritual need within the Roman Empire, especially as urbanization, mobility, and social fragmentation eroded the ancient communal ties that sustained traditional religiosity. Moreover, these cults enabled the formation of transnational spiritual communities that united people of diverse origins, ethnicities, and social classes around shared practices and beliefs, reinforcing cohesion and solidarity within a continental empire. However, it cannot be said that these cults represented a radical break with Roman tradition. On the contrary, Rome's ability to welcome and adapt these new forms of religiosity, integrating them into its spiritual and social structure, was one of the keys to its longevity and resilience. The coexistence of multiple cults, festivals, and practices, even if not always peaceful, was seen as a sign of greatness and universality. The empire was a miniature cosmos, where all gods had a place, provided they did not threaten public order or the power of the state. Nevertheless, this very religious pluralism would in the long run create the conditions for an inevitable confrontation with exclusivist and monotheistic forms of religiosity, such as Judaism and, above all, Christianity, which rejected the syncretic logic of Roman polytheism and affirmed with radicalism the existence of a single true God. Before we arrive at this monumental transformation, it is necessary to understand how Roman spirituality manifested itself particularly in the military sphere, where rituals, vows, and protective gods played an essential role in the formation and cohesion of the legions. This is the theme of the next topic: military religion, from Mars to Mithras, the spirituality of the Roman army, where we will explore how Roman soldiers lived and practiced their religiosity between civic duty and the quest for divine protection during the long campaigns of conquest. Since its very beginnings, the city of Rome was built and expanded through the force of arms, and alongside it walked a specific religiosity, forged in the rigor of military discipline and in the constant need for divine protection. The spirituality of the Roman army was marked by a profound devotion to warrior gods, rites of passage, solemn vows, and collective practices that conferred cohesion upon the legions and guaranteed, according to the Roman vision, the favor of the gods in the campaigns of conquest. At the center of this military religiosity stood Mars, the god of war, one of the oldest and most venerated divinities by the Romans, associated not only with violence and victory, but also with fertility and the very foundation of the city. According to mythical tradition, Mars was the father of Romulus and Remus, the twins who gave origin to Rome, which conferred upon the cult of Mars a foundational and civic dimension that transcended the battlefield. The field of Mars, Campus Martius, a vast area to the north of the city center, was not only the space for military exercises and triumphal parades, but also a sacred territory dedicated to the god who protected soldiers and guided their swords. The rituals in honor of Mars were numerous and carefully observed. Among them, the Equiria Arskell horse races celebrated in his honor, and the Armilustrium Dice, an annual festival in which soldiers' weapons were ritually purified before being stored for the winter, stood out. Additionally, before each military campaign, the devotio was performed, a solemn rite in which the commander or even a soldier, in extreme cases, could offer their own life to the gods of the underworld, the Indimanes, in exchange for the victory of their army. This supreme act of devotion personified the fusion between religion and militarism that characterized the Roman experience of war. Another central aspect of Roman military spirituality was the practice of vows, vota, solemn commitments made by generals before battles, in which they promised to erect temples or offer sacrifices in case of victory. Many of Rome's most important temples were born from these promises made on the battlefield, such as the temple of Jupiter Stator, dedicated by the general and consul Marcus Atilius Regulus after the victory in the First Punic War. Thus, each military triumph was not only a strategic victory, but also a religious event that reinforced the bonds between the army, the gods, and the state. On long campaigns, which took the legions to the most remote regions of the empire, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Syria, Roman soldiers carried not only their weapons and standards, but also their gods. Small portable altars and statuettes of divinities were common in camps, where sacrifices and ceremonies were held to ask for protection and success in battles. Among the most sacred objects was the Cetum Signum, the standard of the military unit, which was venerated almost as a protective deity, kept in a prominent place in the camp and honored in regular rituals. However, alongside traditional divinities such as Mars, Jupiter, and Victoria, the Roman army was also one of the main vectors for the diffusion of new religious cults, especially those of Eastern origin. Among these, the cult of the Mithraiskai stood out remarkably, whose popularity among Roman soldiers was extraordinary. Mithraism offered the military a spirituality that reflected the values and challenges of camp life: discipline, loyalty, hierarchy, courage, and the promise of an existence after death. The temples of Mithras, the Mithraea, were often built near military camps, and many of them have survived to this day, offering valuable archaeological testimony to this devotion. Inside, scenes representing the Chautaroctony, the ritual sacrifice of the bull by Mithras, occupied a central position, symbolizing the renewal of life through sacrifice and victory over the forces of chaos. Initiations into the cult involved physical and spiritual trials, such as the symbolic passage through fire and water, which prepared soldiers to face not only the dangers of war, but also the spiritual trials of existence. The secret and initiatory character of the cult of Mithras, combined with its universalist appeal, welcoming men of various origins and classes, made it a powerful spiritual refuge for soldiers, who found in the Mithraic brotherhood a sense of belonging and mutual support. This communal dimension reinforced the cohesion of military units, promoting the solidarity and discipline indispensable to the success of the legions. Other Eastern cults also gained space among the military, such as that of a Jupiter Dolichonus, a Syrian-Roman deity associated with the protection of soldiers, and that of Belus and Sol Invictus, which offered cosmic and solar visions of divinity, consonant with the empire's grandeur and martial spirit. The cult of Sol Invictus, in particular, gained great momentum from the 3rd century after Christ onwards, being associated with emperors and later influencing emerging religious practices, including Christianity. In addition to collective rites and devotions, Roman military religion was permeated by individual superstitions, which varied according to the origin and personal beliefs of each soldier. Amulets, talismans, charms, and personal prayers were common, reflecting the cultural and religious diversity of the army, which brought together men from all parts of the empire. This plurality, far from fragmenting Roman military identity, was channeled and unified through the cult of standards and adherence to common values of discipline, honor, and devotion. A notable example of the role of religion in Roman military life is the figure of an emperor dubbed as Pontifex Maximus, and at the same time, supreme commander of the armed forces. The emperor embodied the perfect union between political, military, and religious power, often becoming an object of worship himself through apotheosis, the official elevation to divine status after death, a practice that reinforced the sacredness of imperial authority and the legitimacy of Roman dominion. There were military triumphs. In turn were public ceremonies that celebrated not only victory, but also the restoration and renewal of the Pax Deorum, thanks to the intervention and favor of the gods. The victorious general, dressed in a purple tunic and crowned with laurel, paraded through the streets of Rome, followed by his troops, prisoners, and spoils, while offering sacrifices at the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, consecrating his victory and thanking the gods for protection and success. Thus, Roman military religion constituted a complex and integrated system that united tradition and innovation, public rite and personal devotion, collective practice and intimate spiritual quest. It provided soldiers not only metaphysical security in the face of the dangers of war, but also a symbolic structure that gave meaning to their role as instruments of divine will and imperial destiny. However, as the empire advanced and new beliefs spread, especially those that offered eschatological visions and individual salvation, the Roman spiritual landscape began to undergo profound transformations. Among the most significant was the emergence and consolidation of religious festivals that, although rooted in Roman tradition, began to incorporate elements from other cultures and spiritual practices. It is about these festivals and their importance in constructing the religious identity of Rome that we will speak in the next topic. The religious holidays, Saturnalia, Lupercalia, and other festivals that shaped the Roman calendar, where we will explore the celebrations that marked the rhythm of the Roman year and reinforce the bonds between citizens, gods, and the state. The Roman calendar, far beyond being a mere convention to measure time, was a prune mirror of religiosity and the civic identity of the eternal city. Each month, each day, each season carried with it a spiritual meaning, articulated through a sophisticated system of religious festivals that not only marked the rhythm of public and private life, but also reinforced the bonds between citizens and gods, the city and nature, the mythical past and the political present. Rome, in its essence, was a civilization that celebrated cosmic and social order through rituals, banquets, sacrifices, and spectacles, composing a permanent religious theater that gave meaning and cohesion to its existence. Among the most emblematic and popular festivals was the Saturnalia, celebrated from the 17th to the 23rd of December in honor of Saturn, the ancient god of agriculture and abundance, associated with the mythical Golden Age, a remote time of equality and plenty prior to social divisions and wars. The Saturnalia was a festival marked by the inversion of norms. Commercial activities were suspended, schools closed, and slaves, traditionally subordinate, gained symbolic freedom, being able to participate in banquets alongside their masters and, in some cases, even command the table. Laurel wreaths and candles were distributed, while the streets filled with songs, games, and expressions of unrestrained joy. This temporary suspension of social order, far from representing a threat to Rome's hierarchical structure, functioned as a ritualized release valve, a moment in which daily tension was alleviated through collective celebration and the recollection of an idealized past of equality and prosperity. The Saturnalia, in this sense, not only consolidated community bonds but also renewed, through excess and license, the very social order that, soon after the festivities, would be restored with even greater vigor. Another festival deeply rooted in Roman tradition was the Lupercalia, celebrated annually on the 15th of February in honor of Lupercus, an archaic deity associated with fertility, purification, and the protection of flocks. The ceremony began in the Lupercal cave, at the foot of the Palatine Hill, the legendary site where, according to tradition, the she-wolf had suckled Romulus and Remus. The Luperci, priests of the confraternity, sacrificed goats and a dog, then ran through the streets of Rome brandishing strips of leather, the hat februatat, with which they gently struck citizens, especially women, who sought through this gesture to guarantee fertility and prosperity. The Lupercalia, with its rustic, violent, and purifying character, evoked the oldest roots of Roman religiosity, linked to natural cycles. the city's protection, and life's renewal. Even with the advance of urbanization and the sophistication of religious practices, this celebration remained alive for centuries, resisting sporadic suppression attempts and even influencing, according to some scholars, later festivals such as St. Valentine's Day in medieval Christianity. The Roman religious calendar was densely populated with other festivals of great importance and symbolic meaning. The Parilia, celebrated on the 21st of April, marked the purification of herds and shepherds, but also, and above all, the mythical date of Rome's foundation, by Romulus, becoming a moment of identity reaffirmation and exaltation of the city's glorious destiny. During the Parilia, bonfires were lit, and participants jumped over the flames, purifying themselves and renewing their bond with the city's tutelary gods. Another essential festival was the Consualia, dedicated to Consus, the god protector of granaries and stored grains, celebrated in August and December. During this festival, horse races were held at the Piguan Circus Maximus, and horses were adorned with flowers, symbolizing gratitude for the harvest and divine protection over the food that sustained the community. These rites reinforced the intimate connection between religion, agriculture, and subsistence, fundamental pillars of Roman society. The Robigalia, on the 25th of April, was another agricultural festival, celebrated to appease Robigus, the malevolent spirit that caused wheat rust, thus ensuring an abundant and healthy harvest. On this day, dog sacrifices and specific offerings were made, demonstrating once again the Roman conception that the balance between humans and the forces of nature depended on the correct performance of traditional rituals. In addition to festivals of an agricultural and foundational nature, Rome celebrated feasts that reinforced political cohesion and civic identity, such as the Fia Feriae Latinae, which gathered representatives of the Latin cities on Mount Albanus, in a ceremony of common sacrifice and communal banquet, reaffirming the historical and religious ties that united the peoples of Latium under Rome's leadership. The system of Roman religious festivals was carefully regulated and integrated into the official calendar known as the Fasti Amui, which distinguished days considered suitable, dies fastii, for civil and judicial activities from those reserved for the gods, dies nefasti hoa, during which certain public activities were prohibited. The calendar's organization was supervised by the pontiffs, priests responsible for ensuring the correct observance of feasts and rites, as well as determining the dates of movable festivals, such as those dedicated to the Ludi Romani, public spectacles in honor of Tert's Jupiter held in September. The Ludine, or games, were an integral part of religious celebrations, combining the sacred with popular entertainment. Chariot races, gladiatorial combats, theatrical plays, and musical performances were held in honor of the gods, attracting crowds and reinforcing the connection between the city and its pantheon. These spectacles were not seen as mere entertainment, but as sacra officia, religious duties intended to please and appease the divinities. The Roman festivals, in their multiplicity and diversity, expressed the Roman conception of religion as a civic duty, a communal practice, and the foundation of social order, celebrating the gods, fulfilling rites, participating in ceremonies, and respecting the calendar's prohibitions were not personal options but obligations that ensured the city's stability, family's prosperity, and divine protection against internal and external threats. However, as Rome transformed into a cosmopolitan empire, absorbing beliefs and practices from diverse peoples, the Roman calendar also began to incorporate new celebrations, such as festivals dedicated to Isis, Cybele, and Mithras, reflecting the characteristic syncretism of Roman spirituality. At the same time, the emergence of Christianity and its progressive ascent would challenge this traditional festival system, promoting a new conception of time, the sacred, and celebration. Before we explore this clash and this transformation, it is essential to understand how Rome dealt with the arrival of new monotheistic cults, particularly Judaism and Christianity, which, by rejecting syncretism and affirming the exclusivity of their divinity, represented an unprecedented challenge to the Roman religious model. It is about this growing tension that we will address in the next topic: the persecutions of new cults, Judaism and Christianity in pagan Rome, where we will see how the Roman Empire reacted to the emergence of these religions and how this confrontation shaped the spiritual destinies of the West. In the monumental spiritual trajectory of Rome, built upon the principle of syncretism and pragmatic tolerance, few challenges proved as complex and disturbing as the arrival and expansion of monotheistic cults that obstinately and radically rejected the inclusive logic of Roman polytheism. Among these cults, Judaism, and above all its Christianity, emerged not only as new religions, but as spiritual and ethical systems that questioned the ideological and religious foundations that sustained the empire. Rome's reaction to these cults was marked by a combination of curiosity, misunderstanding, repression, and ultimately transformation. Judaism, an ancient and rigorously monotheistic religion, had been present in Rome since at least the 2nd century before Christ, through communities of merchants, artisans, and diplomats who had settled in the imperial capital. Although Jews were recognized as a people endowed with respectable ancestral traditions, which granted them, to some extent, the status of a religiosity, their refusal to worship Roman gods, and above all, to pay homage to the emperor, was often interpreted as an affront to public order and the political cohesion of the empire. This tension reached its peak in the eastern provinces, especially in Judea, where Roman rule encountered a society strongly marked by its religious and cultural identity. The successive Jewish revolts, such as the Great Jewish Revolt from 66 to 70 after Christ, which culminated in the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem by General Titus, and the Bar Kokhba Revolt from 132 to 135 after Christ, were brutally suppressed by the Roman legions, resulting in the dispersion of Jewish communities and the intensification of control and repression measures by imperial authorities. Parallel to the Jewish presence, a new religious movement was emerging within the empire, initially as a minority sect within Judaism itself: Christianity, originating in Palestine with the preaching of Jesus of Nazareth, a figure whom Christians recognize as the Messiah and the Son of God. Christianity quickly transcended the borders of Judea, spreading through the urban communities of the empire, especially among the humble, the enslaved, and the marginalized, who found in the Christian message of universal salvation, spiritual equality, and eternal life a profoundly transformative proposition. Christianity, however, presented itself as a much more radical rupture than Judaism. While Judaism maintained a posture of relative separation and isolation from Roman society, Christianity affirmed itself as a universalist religion intended for all peoples and cultures, and more than that, explicitly denied the legitimacy of Roman gods, asserting the existence of a single, true, and exclusive God. This frontal rejection of the Roman pantheon, and consequently of the pax deorum, the peace with the gods, foundation of imperial stability, was perceived by the authorities as a direct threat to social and political order. The refusal of Christians to participate in public rituals, such as sacrifices in honor of the emperor and civic gods, was interpreted not only as an act of religious irreverence, but as high treason. In the Roman logic, religion was inseparable from citizenship. To honor the gods was also to honor the city and the empire. Thus, Christian intransigence was seen as political subversion, fueling fears that this movement could destabilize the cohesion of the vast and heterogeneous Roman world. The first persecutions of Christians were sporadic and localized, arising more from popular pressures than from systematic state policies. The most famous of these initial persecutions occurred during the reign of Emperor Nero, after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 after Christ. Seeking a scapegoat for the disaster that devastated much of the city, Nero accused Christians, then still a relatively obscure and unpopular minority, of having set the fire. The punishments were brutal. Christians were crucified, thrown to the beasts in the Camera Circus Maximus, or burned alive to illuminate the imperial gardens. This episode marked the symbolic beginning of imperial persecutions, although in the following centuries they took on varied and often contradictory forms. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, the Roman state's relationship with Christianity oscillated between implicit tolerance, indifference, and active persecution, depending on the policies of emperors and local social pressures. Some emperors, such as Trajan, adopted a relatively moderate stance, instructing that Christians not be systematically persecuted, but only when formally denounced and if they refused to sacrifice to the gods. Others, such as Decius and Valerian, launched broader repressive campaigns, requiring all citizens to perform public sacrifices under penalty of imprisonment, confiscation of goods, or execution. Christianity, however, demonstrated remarkable resilience and capacity for expansion, even under the most adverse conditions. Its community networks, organized around bishops and presbyters and had deacons, structured themselves effectively, promoting solidarity among the faithful, care for the poor and sick, and the preservation of doctrinal and liturgical traditions. The catacombs of Rome, subterranean complexes of tunnels and funerary chambers, became not only burial sites, but also places of worship, prayer, and silent resistance to state persecution. The last and most violent of the persecutions occurred under Emperor Diocletian between 303 and 311 after Christ, known as the Great Persecution. Motivated by the desire to restore the empire's unity and spiritual strength, seen as threatened by Christianity's growth, Diocletian's policy sought to eliminate the Christian religion completely through the destruction of churches, the burning of sacred texts, and the execution or condemnation to forced labor of thousands of Christians. Despite the repression's intensity, this persecution failed to stifle the Christian movement, which, on the contrary, emerged from it strengthened in its cohesion and in its identity as a community of martyrs. The decisive turning point occurred under Emperor Constantine, who, after his victory at the Bangzhou Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 after Christ, attributed his triumph to the Christian god, according to the famous vision of Iwaka. In hoc signo vinces, under this sign you will conquer. The following year, the Edict of Milan, promulgated in 313 after Christ, guaranteed religious freedom throughout the empire, officially ending persecutions and paving the way for Christianity's progressive integration into the Roman state apparatus. Thus, the movement that began as a marginal and persecuted sect grew and consolidated until a few decades later becoming the official religion of the empire. With the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 after Christ, under Emperor Theodosius I, who prohibited pagan cults and consecrated Christianity as the exclusive spiritual expression of the Roman state. This transformation, however, was not merely political or institutional, but involved a true spiritual revolution, which profoundly altered Romans' relationship with the sacred, with time, with death, and with the cosmos. Traditional Roman religion, built on pluralism, ritualism, and the integration of politics and religion, gave way to a new spiritual vision centered on personal faith, the salvation of the soul, and divine transcendence. It is about this extraordinary metamorphosis that we will address in the next topic: Christianity and Empire, from persecuted sect to state religion, where we will explore how Christianity ceased to be a marginal community and became the spiritual and ideological heart of the Roman Empire. Few transformations in human history can be compared, in scale and depth, to the religious metamorphosis that led Christianity from a marginal movement born on the eastern peripheries of the empire to the position of official religion and structural foundation of the Roman state itself. In less than 4 centuries, Rome, which once persecuted and executed Christians as enemies of the state, became the center of the new religion, redefining not only the spirituality of its citizens, but also the very foundations of political power and Western culture. This singular trajectory, filled with paradoxes, resistances, and triumphs, constitutes one of the most fascinating chapters in the spiritual history of Rome. The symbolic landmark of this turning point was the rise of Count Constantine Thuorum, the first Roman emperor to openly adopt Christianity. Son of Constantius Chlorus, one of the tetrarchs, and Helena, a woman of humble origins who, according to tradition, had converted to Christianity, Constantine emerged as a central figure in a period of intense political and religious disputes. His decisive victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 after Christ over his rival Maxentius was, according to Christian accounts, preceded by a divine vision, a luminous cross in the sky, accompanied by the message, "In hoc signo vinces," under this sign you will conquer. Inspired by this vision, Constantine is said to have ordered the Christograms and the Greek letters Chi and Rho, initials of R Christos, to be engraved on his army's standards, consecrating his victory to the Christian God. Although ancient sources such as Eusebius of Caesarea may have embellished or symbolically interpreted these events, the fact remains that Constantine from then on promoted a profound reversal in imperial religious policy. In 313 after Christ, Constantine, along with Emperor Cons Licinius, promulgated the Edict of Milan, which guaranteed freedom of worship for all religions within the empire, explicitly including Christianity. This act not only ended centuries of persecution, but also inaugurated a new era of the imperial patronage of the Christian faith. Constantine donated lands, financed the construction of basilicas, such as the majestic Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome and the Pound Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and actively intervened in the doctrinal and disciplinary affairs of the Church. His role as arbiter of religious disputes became evident at the Council of Nicaea. In 325 after Christ, the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church, convened and presided over by the emperor himself. The council sought to resolve the Arian controversy, which questioned the divine nature of Christ, and established the Nicene Creed, defining the Trinitarian orthodoxy that would become central to imperial Christianity. This episode illustrates how, even at that time, the Roman emperor began to act not only as a political ruler, but also as a high defender of the faith and promoter of doctrinal unity. However, Constantine's relationship with the ancient Roman religion was initially marked by prudence and ambiguity. Although he openly favored Christianity, he did not immediately suppress the traditional cults, maintaining, in fact, his position as Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the Roman state cult. This dual role reflects the complexity of the religious transition. The empire did not abandon paganism abruptly, but progressively displaced it from the center to the periphery of public life. The process of the empire's Christianization accelerated under Constantine's successors, especially with Theodosius I, who in 380 after Christ promulgated the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Nicene Christianity as the only legitimate religion of the empire and prohibiting under severe penalties the practice of pagan cults. This act marked the official end of the traditional Roman religion, which for centuries had been the spiritual and political foundation of Roman civilization. The implementation of these prohibitions was accompanied by the closure of pagan temples, the cessation of public sacrifices, and the destruction of idols and sanctuaries, often carried out with fervor by the Christians themselves, who saw in these acts the purification of public space and the definitive victory of the true God over the false gods. The closure of the Temple of Vesta in Rome and the dissolution of the College of the Vestals, which for more than 1,000 years had kept the city's sacred fire burning, poetically and historically symbolize the extinction of the traditional cultu and the transition to a new spiritual paradigm. This transformation was not, of course, free of resistance. Significant sectors of the senatorial aristocracy and Roman cultural elites remained faithful to the old gods, cultivating pagan memory and practices, even under increasing marginalization. Intellectuals such as Symmachus, at the end of the 4th century after Christ, publicly defended the restoration of the altar of victory in the Senate, arguing for the continuity of ancestral religious traditions in the name of Rome's stability and identity. His famous epistolary dispute with the Christian Ambrose of Milan exemplifies the cultural and religious clash that characterized this transitional period. At the same time, Christianity, upon becoming the imperial religion, faced the challenge of adapting to new functions and expectations. From a persecuted and marginal community, it became a state institution, with political prerogatives, social responsibilities, and legal power. The Church organized itself hierarchically, consolidating the role of bishops in Swiss as religious and political authorities in the cities of the empire, developed a social and theological doctrine that sought to harmonize the Christian tradition with Roman legal and philosophical heritage, and created a vast network of charitable institutions such as hospitals, asylums, and orphanages. This fusion between Christianity and empire resulted in the phenomenon known as imperial Christianity, which decisively shaped Western civilization, giving rise to the model of Christendom, in which spiritual and temporal powers intertwined in a complex web of alliances, conflicts, and reciprocal influences. Rome, once the capital of the pagan gods, now became the holy city of Christianity, seat of the hub bishop of Rome House, the seat of Pope, who, in the following centuries, would consolidate his position as the spiritual leader of Western Christendom. At the same time, the architecture of the city was transformed. Pagan temples were converted into churches, new basilicas were erected, the Tyre catacombs became pilgrimage sites and places of martyr cult, and Rome became the privileged destination of millions of faithful who, throughout the Middle Ages, would seek it as a symbol of the continuity between the empire and the church. The trajectory that led Christianity from a persecuted sect to the official religion of the Roman Empire thus constitutes one of the most significant processes in human history, redefining not only the spirituality of the Romans, but also the very concept of empire, authority, and civilization. This transformation prepared the ground for a new era, in which the Roman world would no longer be governed by the gods of the Capitoline Hill, but by Christ the King, the crucified one who had become the universal symbol of salvation. Before we explore the material and spiritual consequences of this transformation in the landscape of the city and the empire, it is essential to understand how religious architecture itself changed with the replacement of pagan temples by Christian basilicas and the redefinition of Rome's sacred spaces. It is about this urban and spiritual metamorphosis that we will address in the next topic: the transformation of sacred spaces from temples to basilicas, where we will analyze how the eternal city reinvented itself to become the heart of Christendom. The monumental religious transformation that elevated Christianity from a persecuted sect to the official religion of the Roman Empire did not manifest only in hearts and minds, but was forcefully and permanently inscribed upon the very urban landscape of Rome and the cities of the empire. The shift in the spiritual paradigm was accompanied by a profound reconfiguration of sacred spaces, which radically altered the architecture, functionality, and symbolism of religious buildings, marking the end of the era of pagan temples and the rise of Christian basilicas as new centers of worship and sociability. For centuries, Roman temples had constituted the highest expression of public religiosity. Erected according to strict architectural canons influenced by Etruscan and Greek models, with their elevated podiums, majestic colonnades, and inner cells reserved for statues of the deities, temples were not spaces intended for congregations of worshippers, but key sanctuaries of the gods, where priests performed official rites while the people participated in ceremonies from the atriums or adjacent squares. Traditional Roman religiosity did not require large enclosed spaces for assemblies or preaching, but rather altars for sacrifices and delimited places for the proper execution of rituals. With the progressive Christianization of the empire, this spatial conception of the sacred was but profoundly altered. Christianity, centered on the community of believers and on the more liturgical celebration of the Eucharist, required spaces capable of accommodating large assemblies where preaching, the reading of scriptures, and liturgical singing could unfold. Thus, the architectural model chosen for the first Christian churches was not that of the classical temple, but that of the basilica, a Roman civil building traditionally intended for legal, administrative, and commercial functions. The Roman basilicas, with their broad longitudinal naves, side corridors, ambulatories, and semicircular apses, adapted perfectly to the needs of Christian worship. The central nave allowed for the gathering of the faithful, while the apse, located at the end opposite the entrance, became the place reserved for the cultors and the unepiscopal chair, symbol of pastoral authority. The choice of the basilica as the architectural model for Christian churches was not merely practical, but also profoundly symbolic. By appropriating a civil space, Christianity affirmed its integration into and dominion over Roman society, transforming what had once been a locus of legal and political power into a space for the manifestation of spiritual power. From the reign of Theseus, Constantine I, we witness a veritable program of Christian monumentalization, which forever altered the urban profile of Rome and other imperial cities. Among the most emblematic constructions of this period is the Basilica of St. John Lateran, San Giovanni in Laterano, erected by direct initiative of the emperor and still considered today the Cathedral of Rome and the mother of all churches worldwide. With its imposing nave and vast interior space, this basilica became the reference model for subsequent churches, consolidating the architectural format that would spread throughout the Christian world. Another notable example is the Basilica of St. Peter in the Vatican, built over the site where, according to tradition, the Apostle Peter was buried, considered the first bishop of Rome. This act of monumentalizing Peter's tomb not only legitimized the spiritual primacy of the Bishop of Rome, but also transformed the eternal city into the epicenter of Christendom, to which, in the centuries that followed, millions of pilgrims from all parts of the world would converge. As Christian basilicas multiplied, pagan temples underwent a progressive process of deactivation, conversion, or abandonment. Some were directly converted into churches in a symbolic movement of religious substitution that reinforced the victory of Christianity over paganism. Others were closed and plundered, with their statues and religious treasures removed or destroyed. The Temple of Vesta, with its sacred flame perpetually tended by the Vestal Virgins, was extinguished, and the priestly college dissolved, marking the end of a millennial tradition that had sustained the city's spiritual identity since its foundation. However, the conversion of sacred spaces was not limited to buildings, but extended also to the urban imaginary and the symbolic topography of the city. Places once associated with pagan ceremonies were re-signified by Christianity. Though on Vatican Hill, once a peripheral and insignificant area, became, with the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, the spiritual center of the new Christian Rome. The Or Catacombs, once simple burial sites and discreet places for the worship of martyrs, were transformed into pilgrimage destinations where the faithful sought inspiration, protection, and divine intercession. Additionally, Christian liturgy introduced new processional itineraries and pilgrimages that redrew religious mobility within the city. The liturgical stations, organized on specific feast days, led crowds through devotional routes, linking churches and sanctuaries, and giving the urban space a dynamic and participatory spiritual dimension, very different from the fixity and localized sacrality of ancient pagan temples. This process of spatial transformation was accompanied by a profound change in one's religious aesthetics. Whereas the pagan temple, with its imposing columns and central divine statue, expressed the distant transcendence of the gods, the Christian basilica, with its longitudinal orientation and progressively developed iconography, sought to create an immersive environment where the faithful could experience the presence of the sacred through preaching, song, communal prayer, and contemplation of our images of Christ, our saints, and our biblical scenes of Homo. The Christian iconography, initially marked by simplicity and codified symbolism, such as the fishhook, the bread case, the anchor, and the Good Shepherd, evolved into increasingly sophisticated and monumental representations, with mosaics and frescoes and sculptures that transformed basilicas into authentic visual cathedrals of faith, capable of educating, inspiring, and moving the faithful, many of whom were illiterate and found in religious art a privileged means of access to the divine mystery. Thus, the transformation of Rome's sacred spaces was not a mere architectural substitution, but a spiritual reconfiguration that reflected the new Christian worldview, the replacement of the localized, ritualistic, and public cult of civic gods by a communal, soteriological, and universal experience of Christian faith. The eternal city, which for centuries had been the center of a ritual paganism, now became the capital of universal Christendom, seat of the papacy, and symbol of the continuity and spiritual renewal of the empire. Before we explore the broader implications of this legacy, it is essential to understand how, over the centuries, Rome consolidated its new spiritual identity, transforming from an imperial capital into a religious capital, guardian of relics, promoter of pilgrimages, and center of Western Christendom. It is about this new spiritual and eternal Rome that we will address in the next topic: the spiritual legacy of Rome, from civic religion to global Christianity, where we will analyze how the city and its religious tradition shaped the Western world and the spirituality of billions of human beings. The spiritual transformation of Rome, from a city devoted to civic cults and the gods of the classical pantheon to the spiritual center of Christianity, did not represent merely a rupture, but also the preservation and reinvention of a religious legacy that would span centuries, shaping the spiritual, legal, and cultural foundations of the West. Rome not only changed its faith, but also exported through Christianity many elements of its civic and religious tradition, perpetuating itself as a universal symbol of continuity, sacredness, and spiritual authority. In Roman civic religiosity, which endured for over a millennium, spirituality was inextricably linked to the state, the community, and cosmic order. Worship of the gods was not a matter of personal devotion, but a festumos, public obligation, a civic duty that maintained the haescin pax deorum, the harmony between humans and the deities, a necessary condition for the prosperity of the city and the empire. Meticulous ritualism, the sacralization of public spaces, the association between political and religious power, and the construction of a collective identity based on the sharing of civic ceremonies constituted the core of Roman religion. With the rise of Christianity and its progressive consolidation as the official religion, many of these elements were not simply abolished, but transformed and reconfigured. The conception of an unbreakable bond between religion and community survived, now in a new form: the idea of a universal Christendom, a spiritual and political community that transcended the borders of the empire and united peoples under the religious authority of the Church and the successor of Peter, the Pope. The very organizational structure of the Christian Church largely replicated the administrative model of the Roman Empire. The dioceses and ecclesiastical provinces mirrored the civil jurisdictions. The bishops exercised not only spiritual functions, but also political and judicial roles. Christian councils resumed in a new key the tradition of public assemblies and Senate deliberations. Thus Christianity appropriated the Roman institutional form, giving it a renewed and universalizing spiritual content. From a symbolic perspective, Rome remained the pan-spiritual centers of the new religious order. The city that had been the heart of paganism became the heart capital of Western Christendom, seat of the most prestigious and influential bishopric, the papacy, and guardian of the most important apostolic relics, such as the tombs of Peter, Mars, and Paul, the princes of the apostles. This spiritual centrality reinforced Rome's vocation as the eternal city, no longer merely through the glory of its emperors and armies, but now through the perennial presence of the apostles' successors and its role as guardian of the Church's orthodoxy and unity. The institution of the papacy, as the supreme spiritual authority, especially after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century after Christ, ensured the continuity of the Roman spiritual legacy amid the political and social transformations that marked the transition to the Middle Ages. The Pope became not only the religious leader, but also in many moments a political and diplomatic actor, negotiating with barbarian kings, organizing the defense of the city, and administering the vast patrimony of the Church. In this context, Rome assumed a new role, that of a holy city, a destination for pilgrimages of faithful from all over Europe, and a symbol of the Church's unity and universality. Thousands of pilgrims flocked to the city to visit the basilicas dedicated to St. Peter, St. Paul, St. John Lateran, and other important churches, participating in rituals, venerating relics, and reinforcing through their presence Rome's spiritual centrality. At the same time, the Roman spiritual legacy spread far beyond the city and the empire through the missionary and cultural expansion promoted by the Church. Christianity carried with it fundamental elements of the Roman heritage, such as law, language, and institutional structure, which combined with Christian doctrine to shape the cultures and societies of medieval and modern Europe. Canon law, for example, was born from the fusion between Roman legal principles and the Church's moral and disciplinary precepts, becoming one of the pillars of Western legal traditions. The Christian liturgical calendar, which still today regulates the cycle of religious feasts and celebrations, preserved in many cases the dates and rhythms of ancient Roman festivals, reinterpreted in the light of Christian faith. Thus the celebration of Time was Christmas Teo, on the 25th of December, overlapped with the ancient pagan festival of the unconquered sun, the Christian feast of Die, All Saints. On the 1st of November, retained similarities with ancient commemorations of the dead, and many popular customs rooted in Roman traditions were incorporated into Christian festivities, creating a cultural continuity that persists to this day. This capacity for absorption and resignification is undoubtedly one of the most remarkable hallmarks of Rome's spiritual legacy. Christianity, by appropriating Roman forms and structures, not only ensured their survival, but also projected them into a global dimension, surpassing the empire's borders and reaching all continents. Thus, Rome's spiritual legacy was not limited to its city or time, but became a heritage of humanity, shaping values, institutions, and identities in every part of the world. Furthermore, the idea of Rome as a spiritual center profoundly influenced subsequent political and religious conceptions. The ideal of a council, New Rome, inspired the founding of Constantinople by Emperor Constantine in 330 after Christ, which became the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and the center of Byzantine Orthodoxy. Centuries later, the idea of a Maketas and a Third Rome would be invoked by Moscow after the fall of Constantinople as the heir of Rome's spiritual and political mission, perpetuating the notion of an imperial and religious succession that transcends time and space. Thus, Rome's spiritual legacy manifests not only in the persistence of religious and legal institutions, but also in the very idea of a universal center, a city that represents permanence, sacredness, and spiritual authority. The expression, eternal Rome, is not merely a rhetorical formula, but the synthesis of a history of over 2 millennia, marked by Rome's unparalleled ability to reinvent itself, to integrate the other, to transform tradition into innovation, and to project itself as a spiritual beacon for successive generations. Before we conclude this journey, it is essential to understand how, in this process of transformation, Roman religion also interacted with the great philosophical currents that traversed the empire, such as Stoicism, Epicureanism, and later Christian theology, composing a spiritual and intellectual panorama of extraordinary richness. It is about this interaction between religion, philosophy, and spirituality that we will address in the next topic: religion, philosophy, and spirituality, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and early Christianity, where we will analyze how Rome was also a privileged space of dialogue, confrontation, and synthesis between different forms of seeking the meaning of existence. The spiritual history of Rome cannot be understood solely through its ritual practices or religious architecture. It also demands that we consider the profound philosophical dialogue that permeated its culture and, over the centuries, shaped, challenged, and enriched its religious conceptions. Rome, as an imperial power, was not only a center of administration and military strength, but also an intellectual laboratory where the great philosophical currents of the ancient world, originating from Hellenistic Greece, encountered traditional Roman religiosity, influencing the forms of individual and collective spirituality that would characterize the empire. Among these currents, Stoicism stood out as one of the most influential and enduring. Introduced in Rome by thinkers such as Panatius of Rhodes and Posidonius of Apamea, Stoicism was quickly assimilated and adapted by the Roman elite, who found in this philosophy an austere and rational ethic, deeply consonant with the traditional values of the almos maiorum tychi: discipline, virtue, civic duty, and resistance to passions. Stoicism offered the Romans a vision of the universe as an ordered and rational cosmos, governed by divine reason, or logos, to which human life must be adjusted through the practice of virtue. For Roman Stoics such as Seneca, Epictetus, and above all the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, philosophy was not a theoretical exercise but a spiritual practice and an art of living, capable of offering the individual serenity in the face of adversity and inner freedom even under the most severe external constraints. Seneca, advisor to Emperor Nero, wrote works such as the Letters to Lucilius, in which he profoundly and elegantly expounded the principles of Stoicism and the pursuit of imperturbability, ataraxia, through the understanding of the transience of existence and submission to the cosmic order. Thus, Stoicism influenced not only philosophical thought, but also the Roman conception of religious and political duty. The idea that the individual must perform their social role with rectitude, without succumbing to passions or fear of death, shaped the ethos of the Roman aristocracy and the very figure of the Stoic emperor, such as Marcus Aurelius, whose work, Meditations, written amid military campaigns against the Germans, remains to this day an exceptional testimony of philosophical and spiritual reflection. In contrast, Epicureanism, introduced into Rome through the translation and dissemination of Epicurus Cacca's works by Guion Lucretius, with his didactic poem De Rerum Natura, offered a radically different vision of nature, religion, and ethics. For Epicureans, the universe was not governed by divine providence, but composed of atoms moving in the void according to natural laws. The gods, if they existed, were indifferent to human affairs, and thus religious fears, sacrifices, and superstitions were considered sources of anguish and spiritual enslavement. The Epicurean proposal was, therefore, a liberation from religious fear and belief in divine intervention oriented towards the pursuit of a life of moderate pleasure, and at friendship, where the absence of pain, aponia, and tranquility of the soul, ataraxia, constituted the supreme good. Although it encountered resistance among Roman traditionalists, who saw in Epicureanism a threat to civic morality and public religiosity, this philosophy also exerted considerable influence, especially among intellectual circles seeking alternatives to official religiosity or criticizing the hypocrisy of ritual practices. However, no philosophical current had such a revolutionary impact on Roman spirituality as early Christianity, which more than a philosophy presented itself as a divine revelation, a historical and eschatological event that demanded a new understanding of existence, salvation, and human destiny. Christianity, though born in a Jewish and Eastern context, rapidly engaged with Greco-Roman philosophical currents, appropriating concepts, refuting doctrines, and elaborating its own philosophical theology, seeking to harmonize revealed faith with natural reason. The first Christian apologists, such as Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and as Origen, developed an intense dialogue with pagan philosophies, recognizing, in many cases, the presence of some seeds of truth, semina verbi, in prior philosophical traditions, while simultaneously affirming the superiority of Christian revelation and the necessity of overcoming pagan errors. Justin, in particular, defended the idea that Christ is the Chazus eternal Logos, the divine reason that enlightens all humans, thus establishing a point of continuity and rupture with the Stoic philosophical tradition. Primitive Christianity proposed a spirituality marked by interiority, the valorization of redemptive suffering, and the expectation of an eschatological salvation, breaking with the centrality of Roman civic and ritualistic religiosity. The figure of the Christian martyr, who faced death with serenity and hope, became in many aspects a counterpart to the Stoic ideal of resistance to pain, but now driven by a transcendent promise of Hasin eternal life with God. The integration of Greco-Roman philosophical thought into Christian theology reached its zenith with Augustine of Hippo in the late 4th and early 5th centuries after Christ. Deeply influenced by the Neoplatonism of Jew Plotinus, Augustine elaborated a monumental synthesis between classical philosophical tradition and Christian doctrine, redefining notions of good, evil, freedom, grace, and history in works such as the Confessions and Asti, the City of God. Augustine constructed a vision of the cosmos and human society that would guide Christian and Western thought for over a millennium. Thus, the philosophical and spiritual legacies of Rome, did not disappear with the Christianization of the empire, but was incorporated, resignified, and transmitted through the structures and doctrines of Christianity, perpetuating itself as a constitutive part of Western culture and spirituality. Stoicism bequeathed its ethic of virtue and duty, Epicureanism, its critique of superstition and its valuation of human happiness, and Christianity, its vision of redemption, love, and eschatological hope. Before we conclude this vast and fascinating spiritual journey, it is essential to turn our gaze to a profoundly human and universal dimension of Roman religiosity, the rites of passage, and conceptions of life after death, expressed in the cult of the dead, funerals, and beliefs about the afterlife. It is about this intimate and solemn dimension of Roman spirituality that we will address in the next topic: rites of passage and funerals, the cult of the dead, and life after death, where we will analyze how the Romans bid farewell to their loved ones and conceived the destiny of the soul beyond earthly existence. Among the multiple dimensions of Roman religiosity, few were as universal and enduring as the concern with death and the rites of passage, marking the transition from the world of the living to that of the dead. In ancient Rome, as in many traditional cultures, death was not merely the end of biological existence, but a spiritual transition, a rite requiring specific procedures to ensure that the deceased reached an appropriate place in the afterlife and that the living remained protected from the unsettling and potentially dangerous presence of the unappeased dead. The Roman cult of the dead was deeply rooted in the conception that ancestors continued to exert influence over the living, either protecting or harming the family, depending on whether they were honored or neglected. Thus, the demons, spirits of the deceased, occupied a central position in domestic spirituality, being the object of regular rituals that guaranteed their benevolence and warded off their wrath. The common expression, dis manibus, inscribed on thousands of Roman epitaphs, dedicated the tomb to the deified manes, acknowledging that in death, humans became part of this spiritual collective inhabiting the underworld. The process of preparing for death began in the final moments of life. It was customary for the closest family member, often the heir, to receive the pious last breath, spiritus, of the dying person, leaning over them to solemnly seal this moment of transition. The eyes of the deceased were then closed, and the body carefully washed and perfumed, dressed in the finest garments, often with the insignias they had borne in life, especially if they had been a magistrate, priest, or soldier. The main funeral constituted one of the most important rituals of Roman society, not only as an expression of respect for the deceased, but also as a public demonstration of the family's social status. More modest funerals were organized by funeral associations, collegia funeraticia, while those of the elite were grand public events that could include processions through the city streets, the display of ancestral masks, imagines maiorum, and the presence of musicians, professional mourners, and funeral orators. The funeral procession led the body to the site of cremation or burial, depending on the prevailing practices of the time. In the early centuries of the Republic, cremation was the most common funerary rite, symbolizing the liberation of the soul through the purifying fire. Later, with the influence of Eastern and Hellenistic cultures, inhumation, burial of the body, became more frequent, especially among Christians, for whom the preservation of the body was linked to the belief in the resurrection of the dead. The burial site was chosen with care, following legislation prohibiting the presence of tombs within the sacred boundaries of the city, pomerium high. Thus, cemeteries and funerary monuments were erected along the roads leaving Rome, such as the famous Via Appia, transformed into an immense corridor of memory, where mausoleums, stelae, and columbaria eternalized the presence of the dead within the city's landscape. After burial or cremation, a funerary banquet, epalumbas, was held, during which family and friends shared a meal in honor of the deceased, reinforcing bonds of solidarity and preserving their memory among the living. This banquet, more than a gesture of consolation, had a ritual function, integrating the deceased into the world of the ancestors and appeasing their soul. The Roman relationship with the dead, however, did not end with the funeral. It was a permanent relationship that required a regular calendar of cults and offerings, to maintain the benevolence of ancestral spirits. Among the most important celebrations were the parentalia, held between the 13th and 21st of February, during which families visited the tombs, brought flowers, food and libations, and renewed bonds with their ancestors. The parentalia concluded with the Halferalia, a solemn ritual to appease the dead and reaffirm the separation between the world of the living and that of the deceased. Another significant celebration was the Lemuria, on the 9th, 11th and 13th of May, dedicated to expelling the Lemures, the restless and potentially malevolent spirits of the dead who had not received proper rites. During the Lemuria, the paterfamilias performed purification rites in the house, walking barefoot and throwing black bean grains behind himself while reciting apotropaic formulas to ward off these unwanted spirits. These rites reveal the fundamental ambivalence of the Roman conception of death. While the dead were honored and revered, they were also feared as presences that, if disrespected, could bring misfortune. Roman beliefs about the afterlife that were not homogeneous and varied according to period, social class, and philosophical or religious affiliation. For many, death led the soul to the underworld, inferi, governed by deities such as in Pluto, Dispata, and Tatin Proserpina, where spirits dwelled eternally in a pale and melancholic existence. This conception, partly inherited from the Greek tradition, viewed the afterlife as a somber but inevitable place, to which the dead had to be guided with appropriate rites, especially the wobol placed in the mouth or hand of the deceased to pay the ferryman Count Charon for the crossing of the river Styx. Alongside these traditional beliefs, philosophical and religious influences diversified conceptions of the soul's destiny. Epicureans, for example, denied any survival after death, considering it simply the dissolution of the atoms comprising the human being, and thus preached liberation from fear of the gods and the afterlife. Stoics, on the other hand, maintained the idea that the soul as a spark of the universal logos reintegrated with the cosmic reason after death. Moreover, Eastern and mystery cults such as those of Dionysus and Mithras and Cybele disseminated more elaborate notions of an afterlife, often linked to the idea of spiritual rebirth and salvation through participation in initiatory rites. These beliefs introduced a more personal and hopeful dimension to Roman spirituality concerning death, contrasting with the more civic and ritualistic traditional view. With the rise of Christianity, conceptions of death and the afterlife underwent an even deeper transformation. Christianity introduced the idea of the unresurrection of the dead, at a final judgment, and the eternal destiny of the soul to paradise, or hell, according to one's deeds and faith. This eschatological vision reconfigured funerary rites, emphasizing inhumation and the preservation of the body as a sign of hope in resurrection, and transformed the tombs of martyrs and saints into sites of pilgrimage, devotion, and miracles. Thus, the rites of passage and beliefs about life after death in Rome constitute one of the most complex and fascinating aspects of its spirituality, revealing the profound human need to give meaning to finitude, to preserve the memory of those who have passed, and to keep alive the bond between the dead and the living. Before we conclude our vast spiritual journey, it is essential to understand how, over the centuries, Rome consolidated its position as a religious capital, center of the papacy, guardian of relics, and privileged destination of pilgrimages, transforming into the holy city that continues to shape the religious imagination of the West to this day. It is about this Christian, spiritual, and eternal Rome that we will address in the next topic, Christian Rome, the papacy, relics, and the holy city, where we will explore how the city reinvented itself as the center of the spiritual world and as a universal symbol of faith. If, at the height of the empire, Rome was the political and spiritual capital of the pagan world, with its temples, forums, and processions dedicated to the gods of the classical pantheon, after Christianization, the Eternal City gradually converted into the spiritual capital of Western Christianity, a radiating center of doctrine, power, and pilgrimage. This metamorphosis, which unfolded over centuries, culminated in the transformation of Rome into a holy city, where the imperial past became indissolubly intertwined with the religious present, creating an urban and symbolic landscape unique in human history. At the heart of this new Rome stood the papacy, the institution that embodied, simultaneously, the continuity and renewal of spiritual authority. The Bishop of Rome, since the 1st century after Christ, had been recognized by Christians as the successor of Saint Peter, the apostle to whom, according to tradition, Christ entrusted the keys to the kingdom of heaven and the leadership of the universal church. This primacy, initially spiritual and honorary, progressively consolidated in legal and political terms, especially after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century after Christ. With the downfall of imperial structures and the political fragmentation of Western Europe, the papacy emerged as the only continuous pan-European institution, assuming not only religious leadership, but also political, diplomatic, and administrative responsibilities. Popes such as Cor Leo the Great, who in the mid-5th century after Christ negotiated with Attila the Hun, and Gregory the Great, at the end of the 6th century after Christ, who sent missionaries to England and reformed the Roman liturgy, exemplify how the papacy managed to reconfigure its authority amidst historical changes, becoming the pivot of Western Christendom. The spiritual centrality of Rome was reinforced by the presence of the most venerated relics of Christendom, especially the tombs of the apostles, Peter and Paul, martyred, according to tradition, under the Emperor Nero, in the mid-1st century after Christ. Monumental basilicas rose above their tombs, the Basilica of St. Peter in the Vatican and the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, which, since late antiquity, have become poles of pilgrimage and devotion, attracting the faithful from all over Europe, eager to pay homage to the apostles and obtain indulgences and spiritual graces. In addition to these apostolic relics, Rome accumulated over the centuries a vast sacred treasure, composed of fragments of the true cross, thorns from the crown of Christ, bodies of martyrs, saints and confessors, as well as liturgical objects of incalculable value. The guardianship of these relics conferred upon the city not only spiritual prestige, but also theological authority, making it an uncontested center of Christian faith and a reference point for the entire church. Devotion to relics, combined with the desire to visit the holy places associated with the church's history, propelled from late antiquity and especially during the Middle Ages the phenomenon of pilgrimages. Thousands of faithful from various regions of Christendom undertook long and perilous journeys to Rome, seeking spiritual redemption, miracles, or the fulfillment of vows. The city, in response to this incessant influx, developed a vast infrastructure to accommodate pilgrims, hostels, hospitals, assistance confraternities, as well as a complex network of station churches, where specific liturgical celebrations were held during certain periods of the year. The height of this pilgrim vocation came with the institution of the Holy Years Aufenthalten to Jubilees, whose first celebration occurred in 1300 after Christ, under Pope Boniface VIII. The Jubilee offered pilgrims who visited the major basilicas of Rome, St. Peter's, St. Paul's, St. John Lateran and St. Mary Major, the possibility of obtaining a plenary indulgence, that is, total remission of the temporal penalties due to sins. These jubilees, initially convened every 100 years and later at variable intervals, transformed Rome into a true planetary center of pilgrimage, attracting multitudes that reinforced its spiritual centrality. At the same time, the city's urbanism was shaped by this new spiritual function. The construction of monumental basilicas, the expansion of smaller churches, the opening of processional routes, and the erection of commemorative monuments created a unique religious landscape where pagan ruins coexisted with the symbols of the new faith. The Arch of Constantine, erected to celebrate the victory of the first Christian emperor, remains as testimony to this transition, while the Via Papal, traversed by popes in their solemn ceremonies, reaffirmed the presence of Peter's successor as the new spiritual guide of the city and the world. The power of the papacy, however, was not limited to the spiritual realm. From the donation of Pepins in the 8th century after Christ and the formation of the Papal States, the Pope also became a temporal sovereign, directly governing vast territories in the Italian peninsula and playing a central role in European politics. Thus, Rome was not only the holy city, but also the capital of an ecclesiastical state, endowed with armies, diplomacy, and administrative institutions. The confluence of these functions, spiritual, theological, liturgical, and political, endowed Rome with a singular and unprecedented character in the history of human cities. It was not merely a religious center, but the beating heart of a spiritual civilization that shaped for centuries the consciences, institutions, and cultures of vast regions of the world. The very idea of the universality of the Catholic Church finds in Rome its most eloquent symbol, the city where all roads converge, where languages and nations meet, and where the throne of Peter's successor remains as a visible sign of the unity of Christendom, even after the profound transformations of modernity, political revolutions, critiques of papal authority, and the secularization of Western societies. Rome remains to this day a spiritual pole of planetary reach, center of the Catholic Church and destination for millions of pilgrims, tourists, and faithful who, traversing its squares, churches, and museums, feel part of a history that transcends time and connects the present to a millennial tradition. Before we conclude our journey, it is essential to undertake a philosophical and spiritual synthesis, reflecting on the extraordinary trajectory that led Rome from the center of imperial paganism to the capital of Christendom, and consider the lasting legacy that this evolution imprinted on the culture, spirituality, and identity of the West. It is about this final reflection on Rome as a symbol of a spiritual eternity that we will address in the next and last topic. Conclusion: Rome and spiritual eternity, from the city of gods to the kingdom of Christ, where we conclude this monumental journey with a meditation on the profound meaning of this trajectory. As we traverse the long and fascinating spiritual trajectory of Rome, from the archaic rites that consecrated every space of the city to the noumena, the invisible and ancestral powers, to the definitive consecration of Rome as the heart of Western Christendom, we witness one of the most extraordinary religious and cultural metamorphoses in human history. This city, once founded under the sign of blood, war, and the divine protection of Calmna, Mars, would centuries later become a symbol of spiritual peace, a center of pilgrimage, the seat of the papacy, and the Tarantino spiritual capital of the West. In republican and imperial Rome, the bond with the gods was essentially civic and ritualistic. The gods were guardians of the city and its order, and the Roman man was, above all, a civs, a citizen whose spiritual identity was realized through participation in public cults and obedience to the ancestral norms of the immos maiorum. Religion was the invisible cement that sustained the empire, ensuring, through rites and ceremonies, the stability of the cosmic and social order. However, the very syncretic and integrative character of Roman religiosity, which allowed the city to welcome and transform the gods of conquered peoples, would ultimately prepare the ground for the most radical of spiritual transformations, the passage from traditional polytheism to Christian monotheism, a movement that, at first glance, might seem antithetical to Roman values, revealed itself, in fact, as a transformed continuity, in which institutional structures, urban spaces, and even certain rituals were repurposed and reinterpreted in light of a new vision of the divine and the human. The city of multiple gods, where temples rose in honor of Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and many others, was converted into the city of the one Christ, the crucified God who, in the eyes of pagans, had been a symbol of ignominy, but who, for Christians, became the supreme emblem of redemption and universal hope. The hills that once supported the altars of civic religion became the sacred ground of basilicas, catacombs, and apostolic relics, marking the victory of a spirituality that transcended ethnic and political boundaries to proclaim the universal brotherhood of God's children. Through this transformation, Rome did not lose its vocation for the eternity. On the contrary, that vocation was reinforced and re-signified. The ancient imperial expression, Roma Aeterna, which proclaimed the city's perpetuity through arms and laws, was incorporated into Christian theology, which saw in Rome not only the center of human power, but the visible sign of the Church's perennial presence in history, that mystical body of Christ active in time and space. Thus, Rome became more than just a city. It became a universal symbol, an archetype of permanence, spiritual authority, and mediation between the human and the divine. From a city founded on the fratricidal blood of Romulus, Rome was converted into the city consecrated by the blood of the martyrs, whose memory was perpetuated on the tombstones of the catacombs in venerated relics and in the liturgical feasts that marked the Christian calendar. This process of spiritual transfiguration was not without resistance, tensions, and violence. The gradual disappearance of pagan cults, the destruction or conversion of temples, the closure of traditional philosophical schools, and the imposition of Christianity as the official religion of the empire all testify to the complexities and contradictions inherent in any paradigm shift. However, the Roman legacy survived, reappearing in new forms in theology, canon law, ecclesiastical organization, liturgy, and even in Christian art, which absorbed and transformed elements of classical aesthetics. Christian Rome, capital of the universal church, heir to imperial institutions, and seat of the papacy, projected itself throughout the Middle Ages and modernity as a spiritual and cultural pole of planetary reach. Medieval pilgrimages, ecumenical councils, religious orders, and missionary movements all passed in some way through Rome, which consolidated itself as the spiritual beacon of the West. But Rome is also an ambivalent symbol, compelling us to reflect on the relationship between power and spirituality. The intersection between the Pope's religious authority and the temporal power of the Papal States, the disputes between the papacy and empires, the crises and reforms that shook the Church, all these occurred under the sign of Rome, confirming that the city is always a space of creative tensions, where tradition and innovation, sacredness and politics coexist and intertwine. In contemporary times, Rome remains a vital center of Catholicism, seat of the Vatican, and of the Roman Pontiff, while also affirming itself as a cultural heritage of humanity, preserving in its millinery stones the testimony of more than 2 millennia of spiritual, political, and cultural history. Walking through its streets, squares, and basilicas, we are led by a narrative that transcends the limits of time and reminds us of humanity's capacity to transform the sacred, to reinvent the meaning of existence, and to seek incessantly the absolute. Thus, in concluding this journey through religion in Rome, spanning the arc from Jupiter to Jesus, from the ritual paganism to universal monotheism, we can recognize that Rome is not merely a physical place, but a spiritual idea, a metaphor of eternity that continues to inspire, to provoke, and to nourish the imagination of human cultures. Rome is ultimately the city where man, in his search for the meaning of life, built and dismantled his gods, reinvented his relationship with the cosmos, and, in doing so, left a spiritual legacy that transcends the centuries and continues to resonate as a calling in the consciousness of all those who, like us, dare to contemplate human history as an unfinished spiritual journey.